Right, so apparently we've reached a point in British society where over a third of university students think the solution to political disagreement is not debate, not discussion, not engaging with ideas you find challenging, but simply banning people you don't like from speaking altogether. A shocking new survey has revealed that 35% of students believe Reform UK politicians should be prevented from speaking at British universities. Not challenged, not protested, not argued against, but outright banned. And here's the bit that'll really make your head spin. 41% of students who actually voted for Reform UK in the last election think Reform politicians should be banned from campus. Let me say that again. People who voted for a party think that party's representatives shouldn't be allowed to speak at universities. We've officially entered the twilight zone, folks. This isn't just about politics anymore. This is about whether we actually believe in free speech, or whether we only support it when it's speech we happen to agree with. Quick favour, if you think free speech matters, regardless of who's talking, hit that subscribe button and smash the bell icon. Over 94% of you haven't subscribed yet. It's completely free, takes literally 2 seconds, and helps us continue covering stories that challenge the status quo. Cheers if you did. Right, let's dive into this absolute mess. So this survey comes from the Higher Education Policy Institute, which is a pretty respected think tank that focuses on university policy and student attitudes. And the findings are genuinely concerning, not because of what they say about any particular political party, but because of what they reveal about how young people view fundamental democratic principles like free speech and open debate. The survey found that 69% of students said universities must never restrict free speech. That sounds good, doesn't it? More than 2/3 supporting free expression. Brilliant. Except when you dig deeper, you find that massive chunks of these same students also back bans on representatives from particular political parties. So they support free speech in theory, but when it comes to actually allowing people they disagree with to speak, suddenly there are conditions and exceptions and reasons why certain voices should be silenced. Reform UK takes the dubious honour of being the party students most want to ban, with 35% favouring preventing their politicians from speaking on campus. But Labour isn't far behind, with 16% of all respondents wanting them banned, rising to 23% among people who actually voted Labour last year. Think about that for a second. Nearly a quarter of Labour voters think Labour politicians shouldn't be allowed to speak at universities. What's going on in people's heads where they vote for a party but simultaneously think that party's representatives should be censored? It's genuinely baffling. And here's the statistic that should worry everyone, regardless of political affiliation. A mere 18% of those surveyed believed all political parties should be allowed to address students at universities. 18%! Less than 1 in 5 students thinks that everyone should get to speak. The other 80+% apparently believe in selective censorship based on political views. That's not liberalism, that's not progressivism, that's authoritarianism with a different brand name. When you decide that only certain approved voices deserve platforms, you're not defending anything, you're just picking whose boot gets to stand on whose throat. The survey also revealed other concerning trends. 38% of students believed academics using offensive material in teaching should be sacked. Not disciplined, not counselled, not asked to provide context, but outright fired. And 64% felt that protecting minorities from discrimination could outweigh unlimited expression. Now, on the surface, protecting minorities from discrimination sounds noble, doesn't it? Nobody wants discrimination. But when you frame it as a competition between protection and expression, you're setting up a false choice. You can protect minorities from actual discrimination, harassment and violence, whilst also allowing controversial ideas to be expressed and debated. These things aren't mutually exclusive unless you define discrimination so broadly that it includes any idea or statement that makes someone uncomfortable.
Reform UK Deputy Leader Richard Tice responded to the survey in typically colourful fashion, calling the findings appalling and demanding financial penalties for universities that allow this culture to continue. He said British universities abandoned being centres of genuine learning, rigorous debate and intellectual challenge long ago, instead becoming echo chambers of far-left indoctrination run by activist academics. Now that's obviously quite a partisan framing, and reasonable people can debate whether universities really are dominated by far-left ideology or whether that's an exaggeration. But what's harder to argue with is his broader point about intellectual challenge. Universities are supposed to be places where ideas are tested, where students encounter viewpoints they disagree with, where the free exchange of ideas sharpens thinking and forces people to justify their positions. When you create an environment where certain ideas are simply banned, where certain speakers are deemed too dangerous to even hear, you're not creating an educational institution, you're creating an ideological safe space where approved thoughts are reinforced and everything else is heresy. Tice placed blame on university leadership for allowing this culture to fester and called on the government to pull grant funding unless things change urgently. That's quite a nuclear option, threatening universities' funding over their free speech policies. But perhaps it's the kind of pressure needed to actually force change, because clearly the current approach isn't working. Universities have been talking about free speech for years, wringing their hands about no platforming and safe spaces and trigger warnings. But the attitudes revealed in this survey suggest that for all the talk, students are leaving university less committed to free expression than when they arrived.
The think tank itself acknowledged that students' views on free speech issues tend to be nuanced and sometimes contradictory, noting that whilst support for free speech in principle has strengthened, support for specific bans has also increased. That's the charitable interpretation. The less charitable interpretation is that students have learned to give the socially acceptable answer when asked about free speech in the abstract, but when faced with concrete situations involving people and parties they actually dislike, their commitment to that principle evaporates faster than water on a hot stove. Now, to be fair to universities, the government has been taking steps to address these issues. The Office for Students was handed more powers to examine complaints from speakers, students and staff regarding free speech infringements. In August of last year, new rules were unveiled binding universities to actively support academic freedom and ensure students can freely engage in discussions without fears over censorship. The regulations also scrapped non-disclosure agreements intended to silence campus misconduct victims, which is genuinely positive. If a university is accused of suppressing free speech, the Office for Students now has authority to investigate and take action. The University of Sussex was hit with a £585,000 fine over failure to uphold free speech just last year. So there are consequences now, real financial consequences, for universities that don't protect open debate. But here's the problem. You can mandate free speech from the top down. You can threaten fines and investigations. You can create all the policies and procedures you want. But if students themselves don't value free expression, if they genuinely believe that banning people they disagree with is acceptable or even virtuous, then no amount of regulatory oversight will fix the underlying cultural problem. This isn't about university administrators being too restrictive. This is about students themselves demanding restrictions. That's much harder to solve because you're fighting against attitudes and beliefs, not just institutional policies. Let's think about why this might be happening, because understanding the cause is essential to finding solutions. One factor is undoubtedly social media, which has created environments where people can curate their information diet to include only views they already agree with, where disagreement is often met with blocking or muting rather than engagement, where pile-ons and public shaming are used to enforce conformity. Students raised in that environment might genuinely not understand the value of encountering challenging ideas because they've never had to seriously engage with them. Another factor is probably the increasing politicization of everything.
When politics stops being about competing visions for society and starts being about good people versus evil people, it becomes much easier to justify silencing the evil people because you're not just disagreeing with them, you're protecting society from harm. That's a dangerous mindset because it treats political opponents as enemies to be defeated rather than citizens to be persuaded. There's also potentially an element of risk aversion. This generation of students has grown up being told that words can be violence, that certain ideas are literally dangerous, that exposure to the wrong viewpoints can cause psychological harm. If you genuinely believe that, then banning speakers isn't censorship, it's safeguarding, it's protecting vulnerable people from harm. The problem is that ideas, even offensive ones, aren't actually violence. They might be uncomfortable, they might be upsetting, they might challenge deeply held beliefs, but that's not the same as physical danger. We've conflated emotional discomfort with actual harm, and the result is a generation that thinks protection from discomfort is a right, rather than encountering challenging ideas being a necessary part of education and growth. But here's what really gets me about this survey, and it's the contradiction at its heart. These students are at university, supposedly the pinnacle of education, places where critical thinking is meant to be developed, where people learn to analyze arguments, evaluate evidence, and form independent judgments. And yet, significant numbers of them don't trust themselves or their peers to hear certain political views without being corrupted or damaged by them. What does that say about their confidence in their own beliefs? If your worldview is so fragile that it cannot withstand exposure to Reform UK or Labour politicians giving a talk, maybe the problem isn't the speakers, maybe it's that your beliefs haven't been tested and refined through genuine intellectual challenge. There's also something deeply patronizing about the attitude underlying these bans. It's essentially saying, I'm sophisticated enough to hear these ideas without being influenced by them, but other people aren't, so we need to protect them. That's not equality, that's elitism. That's assuming you have superior judgment, whilst everyone else is vulnerable to manipulation and needs you to decide what they can hear. Students should be treated as adults capable of making their own judgments about arguments they encounter, not children who need protecting from bad influences.